Eusebius Mckaiser
on 702
for the curious.
6 minutes after 10 o'clock, joining me in studio here in our 702 studios in Sandton is the leader of the Democratic Alliance, Mmusi Maimane. We're going to be hanging out with Mmusi this hour. If you'd like to engage him, you can tweet questions, tweet comments as well. Use the hashtag Maimane with Eusebius, or you can also call us on 011 883 0702 or 021 4460567. Remember, we're also live streaming this hour on our Facebook 702 page, and you're most welcome to watch this conversation about whether or not they are ready to govern, what are their signature ideas for the most pressing issues that we are facing as a society, and of course, you be the judge about the content of the answers that we are about to get from him. Mmusi, thank you so much for making time for us. It's been a while.
Good morning, Eusebius, and good morning to fellow South Africans. It's great to be here this morning.
Mmusi, if you got anything as a party less than 25% on May the 8th, do you think it would be justified for you to still be leader of the DA?
Undeniably so. I think,
Really?
Eusebius, the most crucial issue in South Africa is what the DA offers. The DA offers South Africans a one South Africa for all, a vision upon which all citizens can work together. I'm committed to fighting the battle to ensure that there's a job in every home and to make sure our citizens are safe. And therefore, that vision moves beyond. It is something that I'm deeply passionate about and will commit my life to. And I think the DA is a party that is growing. We now govern for 16 million citizens. We administer a budget of over 170 billion rands. And so I'm comfortable that as an organization we will grow, and it would be legitimate that we focus on the growth of the organization. And therefore I'm confident that we'll take the DA forward.
Obviously, that's aspirational, right? But what I mean is, what are the KPIs for you as leader? And the reason why I say that is, as an analyst, and you don't even need to be an analyst, just as a South African, Jay, if one looks at the state of our society, we are in a horrible state. You have, the diagnoses are obvious. You have economic growth 0.7%, which is not conducive to growing the economy in a way that is inclusive and is conducive to job creation and getting both local and international direct investments to stimulate further economic activity. We are, in terms of not just income inequality, but asset and wealth inequality, one of the most economically unjust societies in the world on a daily basis with the various commissions of inquiry, not only the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. We see on our screens evidence of what a bankrupt ANC-led state has done to you and to me.
Yeah.
In that context, surely the opposition should not get anything less than, say, 30%. If you were to get 22%, 23%, then you don't deserve to be leader of the opposition, given the stark realities of the society we live in, which is a gift to you.
It is an important scenario that we face. I think global forces indicate the fact that in many societies there's a rise in populist movements, etc. Where I'm very comfortable is in the fact that if we take Zimbabwe as an example, you would argue the case that in a collapsed economy, etc., the Zimbabweans, I feel, got duped. A bus carrying ZANU-PF came on board. It replaced its own driver. People thought there was a renewal. And subsequently now Zimbabwe's economy is on the collapse. I think South Africa faces a similar prospect in that you've got this corrupt ANC, a bus that has in fact veered off the road and has put you and I 47,000 rands in debt, and now has a new driver and still heading in the same direction. What cannot be denied is that given those economic conditions, we've got to fight off a populist instinct that could simply promise everyone everything for free, and ultimately this resurgent ANC on the one end, and actually put policy on the table that says, here's what the future of South Africa must look like. I'm comfortable that we've got a plan and agenda for reform in South Africa. I have tabled that. I have gone out into communities and South Africans are hearing us. And actually I'm very comfortable in the fact that the DA will grow. It will grow within this context. You will also recall one of the tough things that the DA has to fight for and contend for is that we live in a country where it's natural. When economic conditions are like that, the racial polarization becomes something that occurs. So on one end, you've got a party that says we're just for whites, and on another end, you've got parties that say we're just for blacks. When you stand up and still espouse that dream of one South Africa for all, it has to break through all of that noise, if you like, so that South Africans can come on board. So I'm very comfortable in the fact that the party will grow.
I hear you. I'm going to ask the question just one last time, right?
Yeah.
And I know it's inherently awkward because I'm asking you to write your own KPI, but that is what I'm doing. Because when I look at what the ANC-led state has done to our democracy, I think to myself, if the DA is not capable of getting their aspirational 30%, then quite frankly, you shouldn't be in the business of politics at all. And the person at the helm of the opposition is you as the party leader. So it sounds to me as if you're dodging the question by effectively saying, and I'm going to put this in your mouth because I like calling a spade, that in the event that our graph starts to flatline for the first time since 1994, because we're now doing scenario sketches, so there are no guarantees, right? So let's take the worst case scenario for you as DA leader. You get 22 or 23%. That we will blame Eusebius populism and the effective use of racial rhetoric on the part of the EFF and the ANC. Is that what you will tell the rest of your DA leadership? Or will you say, actually, clearly, this is an indictment on me as Mmusi Maimane?
No, I think what's happening equally so is that I'm comfortable we're going to grow. So I don't plan for failure. I'm not sitting here today thinking what happens when we go backwards. I'm planning for a party that is growing. You saw on Saturday the fact that South Africans in their numbers showed up. People have written the D off so many times. In 2016, I remember sitting in many radio interviews where people kept saying to me, you'll never govern Joburg, you'll never govern Tshwane. And I'm sitting here today saying to you,
and if you don't grow,
we're going to go and get Gauteng, we're going to go and govern in the Northern Cape and ultimately retain the Western Cape and increase our votes. Those are my crucial KPIs and we are pursuing them. And any leader sets those objectives and that's what I'm going for.
And if that doesn't happen, do you think you still deserve to be DA leader if that doesn't happen?
I don't plan on failure.
Okay, come on, Mmusi, but there are different scenarios. Scenario A,
the DA has a Congress.
Okay, here are the possibilities. Possibility is you surprise us, you surprise yourself, you get 31%. Possibility 2, it's somewhere in between. You get Northern Cape, but maybe not Gauteng. Possibility 3, you keep the Western Cape, you don't get the Northern Cape, you don't get Gauteng, and you get, let's say, 23 or 24%. In that last scenario, and don't tell me that you don't plan for failure, you must consider scenario sketches as a leader in business,
which
you teach business, and as a political leader. In that last scenario, do you think that you still deserve to remain party leader in May?
I'll go to Congress, and the delegates of the Democratic Alliance will make that decision.
Let's talk about what I think as a citizen, and I could be wrong here, so I'm going to be guided by my listeners if they disagree with me, is probably the most important issue for all of us, which is the economy.
Yeah.
Right? As much as race is something that gets our blood boiling. The economy is growing at 0.7%.
Correct.
We had what, in my opinion, is an infeasible projection on the part of the EFF in their manifesto that they can literally within 2 years get us to sustained levels of economic growth of up to 6% without telling us what the causal economic mechanism is that will get us there conveniently. And that is the luxury of not being an incumbent government. What are your targets for growth if you were to become the government of the day in May for the next 2 years? And tell me the story of how you will achieve that target.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I think that we've got to, in the medium term, be targeting whether South Africa can go at least at about 3%. And then that's in the immediate term. And then in the medium term, about 5%, and then try and accelerate growth to match our African peers. I just had a great engagement with the president of Senegal, and Senegal are growing at 6%, given at a low base. Côte d'Ivoire are growing at a much higher rate than that at about 7%. And here are the fundamentals that we speak about. One, if you focus on city-led growth, because inherently, if Joburg, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, Cape Town aren't growing, and eThekwini, effectively the net pool of that simply cannot happen. So we focused on city-led growth because what cities can do is stimulate micro-enterprise in a far more effective way than national government. Our manifesto focuses itself on saying, let's fight for the micro-enterprise to be stimulated because every policy must focus on how we create jobs. Let's become very targeted as to what key sectors give us an opportunity in the short and the medium term as South Africa. We live in a beautiful country, and my dream is that we can increase the number of people who are landing here. We've already demonstrated how tourism is an attractive venture, and I've shown the fact that even in the last year, over just close to 1 million new seats came into Cape Town because we're able to open infrastructure at the airport so that planes can land, international domestic flights can come in. So that's about the one component, and linked to that is about visa regulations. I think that we can use tax as a far more effective way of stimulating manufacturing. South Africa isn't producing enough and exporting enough, and therefore crucially around that is that how do we give the appropriate tax incentives around manufacturing? How do we look at other key industries like agriculture? If you give policy certainty around expropriation without compensation, you can set up the agricultural sector in a way that it can become a job creator and a job driver. Already we've demonstrated that where we're in government, our export levels around agricultural goods and agro-processing is actually far higher than any other province.
Let's slow that down a little bit, because there's a lot of very specific economic claims that you are making. And I'm no economist. The financial journalist listening to this interview can go and pressure test the economic coherence of what you are saying. But I'm going to ask you to explain it in more detail and being more precise. When we talk about getting the economy from the current 0.7% growth trajectory that we agree isn't conducive to dealing with either inequality, let alone with extreme poverty or joblessness, and we're going to get it up to 3%, and you talk about the medium term, give me a time horizon.
Well, I think that by stabilizing the state and building a capable state within the next 2 to 3 years, at least when I talk the medium frame, it's scheduled in a 3-year cycle. So I think in the 3-year cycle, we should be growing at above 2%.
Okay, we're in 2019 now, we're growing at less than 1%. You reckon a DA government can get this economy at sustained levels conservatively of 3% per annum by 21-22?
Absolutely.
How are you going to achieve that?
As I've outlined some of the economic interventions that we can put.
But what you have done is you haven't outlined the economic activities. You've simply stipulated things like cities are underutilized nodes of economic activity.
Well,
that's an interesting description, because city economies is the rage in economic literature the world over currently. But unpack that for me very practically. Well, what suddenly will happen in Bloemfontein, in Uitenhage? What is going to happen in Pofadder in terms of economic activity that will get me? Because 0.3, I mean, to someone who's not numerate, 3 doesn't sound like a lot. But to go from 0.7% to 3% within a 24-month period, 36, that is a gigantic claim.
And it's an important one.
And I'm confident. It's an important one. But it's also an easy claim to make when you're in the opposition. Especially if there isn't if there's a real chance that you may not be in government, which is why the EFF even pegs it at 6%. So tell me how the activities that you've mentioned, why will they yield such incredibly high returns?
Well, firstly, Eusebius, is that it is quite a strange thing that South Africa is underperforming in comparison to all of its peers. So let's ask, what have our peers been doing that we're not doing? One, let's break down the concentration of the market. Tomorrow morning, if Mmusi Maimane becomes president, I will not shy away from passing the ISMO bill that ensures that Eskom is broken up into 2 entities, one for distribution and one for build. This will ensure that our economy has got the appropriate infrastructure to be able to grow. If you talk about ICT rollout, already the economic literature demonstrates the fact that just by being able to secure ICT infrastructure across your country within your first year, you can add a percentage to GDP growth. When I talk about manufacturing, when it comes to places like Pofadder that you've said, our manifesto makes it clear we will pass a Jobs Act that allow for foreign direct investment to come and repatriate some of the profit that comes through or capital. This is by ensuring that, in fact, you give proper incentives. So rather than setting up special economic zones all across the country, I'm saying let's make the country a special economic zone.
Can we, before we take a break, just twin the economic growth conversation with the job creation and the Job Act that you guys talk about, which really leaves me confused, because after the break, I want to deal with one of the more awkward issues, which is around inequality. But let's stick with jobs, because jobs matter. When you talk about a job in every family, it's every home. Yeah, it's right up there with Americans guaranteeing you a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. It rolls off the tongue. What is the mechanism that will get me there?
Well, first of all, we've got 40% of households in this country that don't have a single bit of income coming into them. So therefore, to be able to address that, we say that by focusing on both urban and rural economies, that's why I say, already now, if you look at manufacturing and the potential that it sits, you're able to set up that infrastructure so that we can be able to get more citizens into places of work, make labor law far easier. That's one of the most immediate things that we can do so that more people can get into the jobs market. And then lastly, and more crucially, is about stimulating young people. I want to set up a national civilian year where young people can be able to work for a year, give them 6 months of internships and 6 months where they can work, and we'll pay them over that year so that they are able to get the dignity of being been able to get up and go into work, given the appropriate labor law, given the appropriate stimulus around manufacturing, given the appropriate use of agriculture, and ultimately given the incentives that we can attract for industry to be able to do that.
Okay. 21 minutes after 10 o'clock, we're talking at the moment economic policy. I hope that you find it stimulating because it's easy to talk identity politics. I'm sure Mmusi thought I was going to do that first. But honestly, I think as a country, you and I and Mmusi and the EFF and the ANC, we're never going to realize the potential of our country if we don't get the economy right. And I think one of the things that we need to test each of the parties on, the small ones and the big ones, is their economic claims and their economic plans. But why don't you tell me what you want to engage Mmusi on? 011 883 0702 in Joburg, in Cape Town on 021 446 0567. You can also use the hashtag Maimane with Eusebius. Growing the economy, I would argue, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to deal with inequality.
Correct.
Without growth, we can never be more equal. But sometimes people who don't like talking about the awkwardness of inequality because it implicates history, including racialized histories, they pretend that you can collapse the inequality discussion into a conversation around job creation and growing the economy. A, do you agree with that statement on my part? And if you do, how do we deal with inequality in South Africa as far as the DA is concerned, besides growing the economy, taking cognizance of the fact that economic growth doesn't guarantee a more equitable share of the pie?
Well, I think the biggest assault that brought profound inequality in South Africa was in many ways the project of apartheid. What that did is that it said, for a particular race, you can live in rural communities, you can be far from economic opportunity, and then we will strip you of assets. That gave us an opportunity, that bequeathed to us a society of the insiders and the outsiders. Some people got onto the inside track and people got on the outside track. And that's why when I talk about two South Africas and I want to build one South Africa for all, it is very cognizant of the fact that how do we do asset transfer to ensure that those who are left out are brought into the economy. So here's some first key interventions. One, clearly there's a discussion about asset migration. The first asset has to be about title to people. How do we put that into people's hands in a much more aggressive manner? That's why in the city of Joburg, we've become very intentional about saying you will adjudicate on title deeds much more aggressively, and already we're up to 6,000. That's the first thing. But the second is what Venezuelan economist Ricardo Hausmann makes so profoundly, which is the next great assets that people need is know-how. That's why when we look at this conversation around redress, it cannot be devoid as to how do we transfer know-how into South Africans so that we can make sure people are economically active and participants in our economy. Therefore, you can't deny the fact that education and an unequal education system that we are seeing in the South Africa perpetuates economic inequality, coupled with the fact that access to opportunity then becomes denied. The third, I partly agree with your statement, but you can't deny the fact that the greatest exacerbator of inequality is the lack of job creation. The fact that people don't have a job puts them at a level that is far more disadvantaged when it comes to this conversation. That's why we cannot deny that if we put income or we put a job in every home, we begin to then create the opportunity for people to be able to get onto the economy. And then lastly, I think without a shadow of a doubt, I am really keen to say, how do we stimulate a jobs and justice fund that will do the following things, that says, in terms of asset transfer, if you take a sector like the insurance sector, which is concentrated in a few, let's create a fund that will be able to fund new insurance companies that can come on board so that we can give asset to people.
Okay.
And it goes further, because when you get into mining shares, etc., we must give shares to people who work in the mine rather than giving shares to people who are politically connected and contribute very little to the economy.
I'm going to critically engage in some of that. I don't disagree that jobs help to improve the Gini coefficient, for example. What I am suspicious of is the idea that title deeds plus extra know-how and a job in every home.
And shareholding.
I'm not convinced that that as a package can break the back of colonialism and apartheid's inequalities that we've been bequeathed. But we can debate that in a second. Let's hear from the public. Tabang, good morning.
Morning.
Go ahead, sir, very quickly. What do you want to say or ask?
Dumela ntate le kae?
Yeah, I just want to vote for the DA, but the problem is we want land. It's like I'm from the township, and where we stay in RDP houses that are very small, and as the DA, you're talking about giving people title deeds. How are the title deeds going to help us when we don't have land and when we don't have jobs? Because I think if we have land, we can be able to create more jobs for us. So I just want to vote for the DA. But this question of land, you are against land expropriation. So I just want you
Okay, interesting question. Thank you, Tabang. We're going to get to the land question. Tim, what's your question?
Hi, Eusebius, thank you very much for taking my call. Mmusi Maimane, dumela.
Dumela Khosi Mpusa.
All right. My issue is around crime. You know what? I don't feel safe to live in South Africa anymore simply because of the rate of crime here in South Africa. Criminals seem to have more rights than the law-abiding citizens. So what does that DA have, for an example, that will make South Africa to be a safe country to live in? Because at this particular moment, you know, you have to watch your back everywhere you go when you drive and things like that. There is no control. You know, illegal people are coming to the country. You know what? It's so scary. So
Okay, we've got it, Tim.
Yeah, hi there, Eusebius. 3 quick questions. First one, Mmusi, you talk of apartheid made people live far away from their places of work, 100%. But yet, when Patricia de Lille was mayor of Cape Town, she wanted low-cost housing in Sea Point where people earning under 6,500 rand could abide. It was very same DA, part of the DA that actually stifled her with this, and they stopped it and sold it privately to another consortium. How do you answer that, number one? Number two, if you claim the DA is the best run in the Western Cape, why is it, for example, in the water crisis, the municipality of Laingsburg and Beaufort West went directly to Gift of the Givers for water and not coming to the DA Congress in Cape Town? 2, 3, Mmusi, the last one is, you know, you keep talking, go, if you finish the show, drive to Central Joburg, which is run by the DA, obviously, in coalition. Look at the site of Joburg. Earlier on, Bongani Bingwa had a show on one of the wards, Fordsburg. Drive through Fordsburg and Mayfair, which is run by a DA councillor, and see what you come up with. Thank you.
Okay, so let's unravel some of these issues. I want to first start with inequality. I want to keep it practical here.
Yeah.
So here's the thing about jobs, right? And I mean, we know this stuff, Mmusi. You and I can be employed and we can still be exploited because of institutionalized racism. So having a job is not a guarantee that I will be treated decently in terms of the history of how inequality plays out in the labor market in South Africa. That is precisely why we even conceived after 1994 of the labor rights regime that we have. That's precisely why we've had over the last year or 3 an incredible national debate where we can disagree reasonably on minimum wages, for example, and it is precisely why we have codified certain kinds of rights that people have in terms of labor law. Those protections exist precisely because inequality is a complex thing, and merely giving someone a job is not a guarantee that you are dealing with the different elements of inequality. So when you say to me, let's grow the economy, let's try and get people working, I don't have a problem with that. It will make a difference to inequality. But you are skirting around the more awkward, enduring elements of inequality that will not be caught by giving someone a job, such as inequalities that exist inside of our institutions, public and private.
No. The rights of people who work, you are correct, Eusebius. Post-1994, we created a labor legislation framework that protected the rights of those who work. Now, the difficulty is this, is that much of those rights have to be exercised and have to be given credibility to, so that someone who is exploited in a place of work has got rights to stand up and have got recourse that comes into that. That at one level is part of the discussion and we can enter into it. Or another level, the fact of the matter is that the South African Parliament, you know, when I sit in Parliament, often I hear about the interests of those who work. I hear about the interests of the particular legislation that you are speaking about. But I don't hear enough about the rights of those who don't work. And so you and I might debate what happens to break down that wall of those who work and not work. Because the more we build up more rights for those who work, you can appreciate. Let me take a legislation that you've just touted, that of minimum wage. Our minimum wage at the moment is set at 80% of the median wage. Treasury have already argued the case to say 700,000 South Africans will be out of work as a function of that legislation. Now, you and I agree. Of course, we want people to earn more. But we can appreciate that there's now a metaphorical wall that President Ramaphosa has built that will leave people on the outside, which even whilst the rights of those on the inside are protected at work, those who are on the outside's rights don't exist. So I am standing here as leader of the DA, arguing a simple case, which is to say, let us fight for the rights of those who don't work. And rights and equal rights are not a pie. Just because you give rights to other people does not suddenly mean you take away rights from other people. Therefore, to your argument, let's give the right to the individual. Let's give them the right to opt in and opt out. So let's give them the right to get a job, because once they're in there, fair enough, they will be guaranteed in those rights that you've just described. And ultimately, we can begin to take a serious assault on income inequality. That's one component.
Okay. You see, Mmusi,
but there's another component.
The analysis you're giving is perfectly coherent. I don't find it convincing. And as a floating voter, I'm not attached to any party. I don't want to vote EFF. I don't want to vote ANC. I've got beef with both of those parties as a voter. I want to potentially take you seriously as being on my shortlist. But despite being a black professional who's degreed and middle class living in Sandton with a good salary at Prime Media, I know what unemployment looks like. And I don't accept the idea that the view that I've articulated to you is a view that renders the unemployed invisible. My God, I know the burden of having to subsidize unemployed people in my family. I want them to work as well. So I want to say two things to you, and let's engage whether your analysis goes far enough in terms of understanding what we can't choose between. The DA, just like many right-wing economists in this country, put the exploited worker against the unemployed person. And then you want to blackmail those of us who are poorly treated with a job by saying, but Eusebius, if we were to have a minimum wage that we set that is compulsory in your sector, let's say in the media, let's say we compel every media house to pay producers at least 20,000 Rand, then Kampi sitting outside, who's the cousin of Mava, is never going to be employed. I don't accept that analysis at all. We don't have the luxury of choosing between the following two things, which is the false dichotomy that you are putting on the table, that either we get everyone employed without talking about the conditions of employment, or alternatively, we talk about decent work and we accept that we will always have high levels of joblessness. That dichotomy is BS. We need to get people working, and we need to stop employment in the labor market. And it seems to me that the DA isn't interested in exploitation. And the way to try and get around it, to still sound like you are pro-poor, is to say the reason why we don't want all this hefty legislation in terms of labor law is because we secretly care about the unemployed, as if the rest of us don't.
Eusebius, I think you failed to hear me. But
I think we disagree. I do hear you. No. I just don't buy that argument. I've heard it from economists on the right all the time.
I've made it crystal clear that equal rights are not a pie. Just because I want to protect the rights of those who are unemployed does not mean I'm taking rights away from those who are employed. That was a statement I made.
No, but I didn't accuse you of that.
And
I'm saying that you are blackmailing exploited workers by saying if you demand certain kinds of wage levels to reduce wage disparity in corporate South Africa, that the cost of that is that unemployment will be high. I don't accept that is a fait accompli. And in that sense, the DA is pitting the exploited worker against his unemployed cousin.
I'm simply saying that people have the right to sell their skills at whatever respective cost they want to put so. I'm simply saying to you, when people come into places of work, their rights are protected. Labor law protects that. I'm not taking that away. What I'm simply asking for is that in strengthening that. I've even argued strongly for shareholding amongst people who work. Why should the producer only depend on a salary on this particular show? Surely they can be a shareholder within Prime Media. Isn't that part of asset transfer?
Would you legislate that?
Of course. And what I've argued even furthermore is to say that one of the redress mechanisms that we've got to look at is how do we strengthen the pension of black South Africans so that, to your question, I'm not blackmailing you. I live as a black South African who has to support family members. I understand this issue better, but I don't want them to be simply dependent on my support. I also want them to work. So it's not a dichotomous argument as you put it. I'm simply saying that if you were to strengthen some of the pension mechanism of many black South Africans, you could be able to achieve the appropriate wealth transfer that comes with that over the long period of time. We cannot, Eusebius, simply put one against the other.
But this is what you guys are doing.
at the end of the day, also ignore the sea of unemployment that is upon us and not seek out ways to legislate so that more people can find jobs.
No, but okay, let's put that aside, because there are drivers of unemployment that one can tackle to reduce unemployment without shying away from the hard conversation in terms of inequalities, including wage inequalities in the workplace. But the other element of this that makes it really hard for floating voters to know whether to take a chance on you guys, is the implicit analysis of power. When we talk about the sectoral bargaining power of a particular sector that has an industry body, for example, and you often hear this from the South African Institute of Race Relations, which is not a think tank I would want a political party of my choice to attach itself to ideologically, that the economic freedom of the individual worker must be respected, which is true. That's an intuitively good philosophical position to hold. But in the real world, let's keep it real. There is an unequal dispersion of power that happens in the workplace. And the reason why we talk about sectoral interests is precisely because when the bosses, when the ones who have the means of production that they own are negotiating with Nimkompoop Eusebius, the individual, you can't talk about an equality of power. And that's where your analysis, I'm afraid, is not convincing.
No, Eusebius, this is where I think that's the next point, almost a different discussion, because actually the discussion we must have, and I hear, in fact, I'm speaking at the Black Business Council on Friday to speak about some of these issues. Because I do understand the black professional who says, here I am as a manager, but my secretary, who happened to have been there for a long period of time, earns more than me. I understand that. Many black professionals share that with me. That's why we've got to ensure that at all levels of power levers within organizations, that there's sufficient representation that can be able to uphold the rights of the people who work. I was one of the few who said, I wonder whether in board representation, can we not get union representation on there as a significant proportion? Because that way we have a conversation that not only achieves the outcomes of the organization, but achieves the outcomes of the labor cohort within that. These are not so I'm very alive to this very discussion that we're having about what professionals, particularly black professionals in places of work, go through. But that is one component of the issue of addressing inequality. What I think you mustn't do is then be dismissive of the question. And it's not about guilting anybody. It's about the fact that just like you and I, who support our family members, know that that support is limited. It's finite to you as an individual. We have to make sure that family members also get work. That is not a BS argument. That's about saying, let's get more people in places.
But Mmusi, let's get back to practical interventions. What I don't hear you khanning on about with a loud hailer are questions of the super rich being taxed more progressively, capping, for example, executive salaries. So we go for low-hanging fruit in terms of economic justice in the corporate sector before we say that, sorry, Marva, to use you again as a prop, that the producer that wants to get a reasonable salary mustn't make that demand until their cousin is also employed as a junior in a media company. That's the point that I'm making. So it's a question of emphasis, but the emphasis reveals to me the politics of the party.
But equally so, you've got to then be coherent to what you stand for. We mustn't deny the fact that we are in an industry that is competitive for skills. And therefore, if you as an executive, you host the show, you have the right to demand whatever money you want. That's a fair conversation. Why should I cap how much money you should demand? Surely you can go to any other radio stations. You want to go work for the BBC tomorrow? You are competing on a global stage. And there is very few economic models that have proven the fact that capping maximum wage has achieved the outcomes that we think it will achieve.
I honestly don't have a problem with anything you're saying. I love it when a political party reveals itself. You don't have to cap what I can ask for, but you are dangerously floating between liberalism and libertarianism. And I'm not so sure whether the latter is conducive to dealing with economic injustices in our country. Mmusi, Tabang wanted to know whether we'll get the land back.
Absolutely, Tabang. And you know very well that where the DA governs, we've already accelerated the delivery of title back to South Africans. Over 100,000 already in the Western Cape. Here in Joburg, over 6,000. It's one of the things that we've become deliberate on. Secondly, I think when it comes to land reform in agricultural sectors, we've introduced programs that ensure equity between both workers. And therefore, we've demonstrated the success of that program. Thirdly, I think when it comes to restitution, we are of the complete complete view that we don't need an amendment to the Constitution to ensure that Section 25, just and equitable compensation, is already there. By the way, Eusebius, expropriation without compensation already happens in our country. It just happens to black South Africans who don't have title. Therefore, if we give title to citizens, we can ensure the fact that they can be able to be just and equitably compensated, which is what Section 25 of the Constitution says. And I'm arguing that where there's a debate around compensation, we can then deal with what the judicial system can do so that we can be able to adjudicate that point.
How much stolen land in the Western Cape, in terms of what was historically stolen from black people, have been given back?
Our program of restitution, comparative to other parts of the country, is far ahead. Because
no, I'm not asking comparatively, I'm asking in absolute terms.
I don't have the exact figure here in front of me, but I think more than anything, when it comes to even agricultural land, we've seen a 60% improvement rate. So
you don't have the number you think it is, but you're sure?
No, I'm talking about agricultural land coupled with land restitution that has been taking place. And remember, when we talk about these actual numbers and figures, we are discussing a competence that is located for national government in this regard. And that's why my concern as to why we're now wanting to introduce a constitutional amendment is because we're shying away from the fact that we've adjudicated a budget for land reform that is less than that of VIP protection, which indicates how the ANC takes this matter as a serious one. I'm saying I'm with President Kgalema Motlanthe in this regard. Let's adjudicate the appropriate financial resources, political will, we can be able to deal with.
But the two issues we need to disaggregate here. The one is easy, and that is to put the ANC on trial. And the way you do so is to look at the declining budget for land reform over the past 25 years. They don't take land reform seriously. We can also speak to constitutional experts about how to properly interpret the existing legislation, and you spot on. In fact, the former president of the ANC's agreed that the legislative framework is adequate for progressive land reform. The ANC hasn't done it. All of that is trite. But then there's a separate debate. There is a principal debate that remains alive regardless of whether the ANC comes or goes, and that is the question of whether land that was stolen, which is unjust acquisition of land in historical terms by white people that arrived here, black people own this land, whether it is just to give any compensation to people for land that was historically stolen. What is the DA's view on that matter?
My view is that that land must be restituted. But here is the trial. So Eusebius says, I used to live here. The graves of my forefathers are here. I want that land to be restituted back to my family. I'm saying the determinant of that compensation ought to be the judicial system. So you arrive in court and the court say, actually the just and equitable compensation here must be 100 rands.
You say that's not good enough. No,
it's 100
back
rands.
to you. This is a political question that South Africans must settle. Yes. I don't give a damn what judges think. What does Mmusi think? Do you think that land that was stolen should morally be subject to any compensation? The law can do what we tell it to do.
The law can determine that the compensation can be 5 rand.
What do you think politically? What do you think morally? Forget about the lawyers.
It must be 5 rand or 100 rand. And once we've done that, we've secured the asset so that it retains the value.
So there must be compensation.
If you argue the case that we must remove compensation.
No, I'm not arguing anything. I'm asking your view.
I'm giving you my view.
What is it?
Because I told you that the rand value can be as low as 100 rands, which we can afford. But it secures private property and ensures that the asset still retains its value. Once you start to remove compensation and give political power to politicians, what you'll end up doing is politicians adjudicating who should own the land, and by political connections rather than a legal process.
Mmusi, you are clear as mud. You're not going to get away with this one, even if we don't get to another issue. I want clarity, because for voters, the land question matters. Simple question. A non-legal question. This is a moral and an historical and a political question I'm putting to you. You better have a view. You can't kick for touch legally.
Compensation must always be in place.
What is the argument for compensation when the counter argument from the activists and some of the left-wing commentators go as follow? Tell me what you make of this critique. That when you have unjust acquisition of any property, it doesn't properly belong to you in terms of moral rights, and therefore no compensation is due you by the state or society given the genesis of how it was acquired. That's the form of the argument. Which part of that argument do you find unconvincing?
It's a simplistic argument to the fact that when you talk about even certain agricultural land, you would agree that that land in and of itself has also had other assets added to it, etc. So whilst I agree there's an unjust acquisition of it, why are we so thinking that removal of compensation will mean the appropriate restitution of that land? It does not do that. And by compensation, when you look at even the Mala Mala case, let's use a practical case in point. Here's a community that had a proper restitution case that was adjudicated. The state decided to take more than half the land reform budget, R1 billion, and gave it to a particular individual. Whilst the courts at that point were arguing the case that bring us this case so that we don't spend R1 billion adjudicating this case. What we should rather have done is gone to a court, and I would argue the case that the compensation would have been far less, and if it was deduced,
but you're right, but
it would have been R100, then we would have done restitution and secured the asset along the way.
And we've
private property
but
rights is
Mmusi,
crucial.
that case is not going to help you with voters who are sick and tired of hearing the DA critique the ANC. We've heard brilliant land lawyers like Advocate Tembek and Kakobi tell us how that case was messed up by the ANC government. We know that. We want to understand, which is why I have deliberately, and I hope you will appreciate that I've helped you in this regard, I've not asked any questions about the state of the ANC because we want to know what you will actually do. So my question is, if people have developed the land that was originally stolen, should the calculus of what they are due go beyond what they have added to the land?
No, and that's why I'm saying what voters want, they don't just simply, they recognize that actually they want their rights to be protected. You take your model and say it simply must be EWC and give political people the right to decide, you will end up with a Venezuela on your hands.
That's not what I said at all.
I'm
trying to establish a principle. The model of how you execute it will come after that.
And the principle is, once there's a restitution case that has been proven and a judiciary says, Eusebius, on this land you happen to have put R100, you are just and equitably allowed to have R100. That's the decision that we make.
Last question, we just have a minute left for it. I wanted to ask you, as far as you are concerned, is racism still a big problem in the country or not, and how do we tackle it if it is? Is it it probably is a problem, but how do you characterize its nature and scope, and how do we deal with it?
Of course, I think that there is in some ways social interactions where people are racist in and of themselves, and I think South Africa has created enough legislative framework to be able to condemn that, and I think we as a society, the center that holds, actually don't tolerate racists. And I'm actually much more appreciative of some of the things that happen on social media, that in fact where someone makes very strong racist utterance, I think South Africans across the board are quick to condemn.
Yeah, but my question, the empirical question that I wanted to ask you, even at a level of just gut, is racism a big problem in South Africa? And I use the word big deliberately.
Of course it is, because I think the secondary problem that it creates is that I think it creates political parties that think that they can profit from it. That's the next dangerous part, when you on one hand have a party that says we're just for white people, on another end you have a party that says just for black people. That perpetuates racial polarization, which fuels the racial inequality that we have. Furthermore, we have an economy that still locks out people. So when I talk about one South Africa for all, it's the ambition that says we are not in a contestation of one race versus another. It's about uniting races together so that we can condemn the ills that come with social racism, economic racism, and the inequality that we face in society. And that takes all of us not fighting against each other, but fighting for each other.
Mmusi, all the best for the election, and thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much.